Who are the greatest, the Stones or the Beatles?
I don't care.
No?
I think it's an irrelevant question.
Yeah.
Here's a detail most people get wrong. The Beatles didn't start as enemies of the Rolling Stones. They helped them. In the early 1960s, before the charts, the hysteria, and the mythology, Mick Jagger and his band were struggling to break through. They were hungry, ambitious, and largely overshadowed by a group that seemed unstoppable, the Beatles. Then something unexpected happened. John Lennon and Paul McCartney handed the Stones a song, I Want to Be Your Man. It wasn't charity, it was encouragement, and it worked. The single helped the Rolling Stones gain attention and credibility almost overnight. On the surface, it looked like camaraderie. Underneath, it planted a seed. Because gratitude in the music world is complicated. Every comparison that followed, every headline, every sales chart, every screaming crowd quietly reinforced the same question. Who was really better? Jagger noticed how the press framed it. The Beatles were the innovators. The Stones were the challengers. One band was adored. The other was dangerous. And Mick learned fast. If the world insisted on comparing them, he would stop trying to compete musically and start competing psychologically. Image would become a weapon. Persona would become strategy. The rivalry didn't begin with insults or anger. It began with a favor that never stopped being measured. And that tension would shape everything Mick Jagger did next. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel. The rivalry didn't explode on its own. It was manufactured. British tabloids quickly realized something powerful. Audiences didn't just want music, they wanted conflict. So the narrative was sharpened, simplified, repeated endlessly. Beatles versus Stones. Clean versus dangerous. Smiles versus sneers. And suddenly, there was no room for nuance. Mick Jagger understood the trap almost immediately. He saw how interviews were edited, how quotes were framed, how every casual remark became ammunition. So he adapted. Instead of denying the rivalry, he leaned into the contrast. The Rolling Stones weren't trying to sound like the Beatles, they were trying to be everything the Beatles weren't. Sexual, confrontational, unpredictable. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was branding. Meanwhile, the Beatles soared creatively, releasing increasingly ambitious records. Every leap forward tightened the pressure on the Stones, and Mick felt it not as jealousy, but as urgency. Because the rivalry wasn't about songs alone. It was about relevance. Who mattered more? Who defined the decade? Who would still be talked about when the noise faded? Behind the bravado, Jagger was calculating. He rarely attacked directly. He smiled, deflected, chose words carefully. Silence became a tool, and that restraint made the rivalry far more powerful than open hostility ever could. Because nothing fuels competition like pretending it doesn't exist. Publicly, Mick Jagger played the role perfectly. He laughed off comparisons, praised the Beatles' talent, claimed there was no real tension, but privately, he was studying everything: how they dressed, how they spoke, how they controlled the room. The Beatles were presented as approachable geniuses. The Rolling Stones would be the opposite: dangerous, sexual, untamed. This wasn't accidental. Mick reshaped himself deliberately. His movements became sharper, his stage presence more provocative, interviews more guarded. He wasn't trying to outright Lennon and McCartney, he was trying to outlast them. And it worked. As the decade progressed, the Stones became the band parents warned about, the band the press feared, the band that felt risky to support. Mick Jagger understood that controversy sticks longer than charm. But that transformation came with a cost. Because every new Beatles release raised expectations, and when Sgt. Pepper arrived, it changed the rules entirely. Art, concept, ambition, suddenly the bar was somewhere else. The Stones felt the shockwave, and Mick Jagger knew one thing with certainty. The rivalry had entered a phase he could no longer ignore. What came next would test his confidence, his band, and his carefully constructed silence. When Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band landed, it didn't just impress people, it destabilized everyone else. The album redefined what a rock record could be: concept, ambition, cultural weight. Suddenly, pop music wasn't just entertainment, it was art. And the shockwave hit the Rolling Stones immediately. Mick Jagger didn't panic publicly, he never did. But behind closed doors, the pressure was undeniable. The Beatles had raised the ceiling, and the Stones were now expected to respond, not later, but now. The result was their Satanic Majesty's request. On the surface, it looked like experimentation, psychedelia, studio tricks, a conceptual turn. But insiders knew it was something else too, a reaction, a challenge accepted under duress. Not everyone in the Stones believed in that direction. The sessions were tense, unfocused, substance-heavy. Ideas collided without clear leadership. And for the first time, Mick Jagger found himself navigating uncertainty instead of confidence. The album wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't a victory either. And Mick knew it, because the comparison was unavoidable. Critics lined the records up side by side. The Beatles were seen as visionaries. The Stones looked like they were chasing. That moment left a mark. From then on, Jagger became even more cautious about acknowledging rivalry, because admitting pressure would mean admitting vulnerability. And that was something he refused to give the world. If Mick Jagger mastered silence, Keith Richards did the opposite. Years later, Keith openly dismissed Sgt. Pepper, calling it disorganized and overrated. The words were sharp, dismissive, and revealing. Because insults like that rarely come from confidence. They come from wounds. Keith framed it as honesty, a bluesman unimpressed by studio excess. But underneath, there was something else. Irritation that the Beatles had shifted the conversation somewhere the Stones didn't control. Mick, notably, never echoed that sentiment. He let Keith speak, let the quote circulate, let the heat land elsewhere, and that decision says everything about how Mick handled the rivalry. He understood that public disdain ages poorly, so instead he played the long game, praise without submission, distance without denial. He refused to look threatened, even when the industry clearly was. That restraint wasn't passive. It was tactical. Because Mick Jagger knew the rivalry wasn't about winning a moment, it was about surviving decades, and reacting emotionally would only trap him in the same comparison loop the media loved. Still, Keith's comment lingered, because sometimes the things bandmates say reveal truths the frontman carefully avoids. And that truth was simple: the rivalry still stung. Decades later, when most rivalries should be safely buried, Paul McCartney casually reopened the wound. In a modern interview, he described the Rolling Stones as essentially a blues cover band. The remark was delivered calmly, almost academically, which made it more cutting. It went viral instantly. And suddenly, people weren't talking about the 1960s anymore. They were talking about now. Mick Jagger was asked to respond. His answer was measured, polite, almost friendly. He pointed out that the Beatles also began with covers. He smiled, he reframed, he moved on. But the subtext was unmistakable. This wasn't dismissal. It was correction. Mick didn't attack McCartney. He didn't escalate. He didn't joke. He simply restored balance, reminding everyone that origin stories don't determine legacy. And that response revealed something important. The rivalry never truly ended. It just matured. Because even now, a single sentence can revive decades of comparison. And Mick Jagger still chooses his words like a man who understands how much weight they carry. But the most interesting part isn't what he said. It's what he still refuses to admit. And that's where the story gets even more revealing. For years, Mick Jagger spoke about the Beatles with polish and distance. Compliments wrapped in neutrality, smiles without substance. Then, unexpectedly, his tone shifted. During the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction for the Beatles in the late 1980s, Mick stood on stage and said something he had never said so plainly before. He admitted there had been rivalry, not jokingly, not dismissively. He used the word carefully and deliberately. He also mentioned friction. That mattered, because Mick Jagger doesn't choose words casually. For decades, he avoided framing the relationship as competition. Yet there he was, acknowledging tension in front of the world long after the stakes were gone. The admission felt less like nostalgia and more like release. It suggested that the rivalry wasn't something he had outgrown, it was something he had learned to manage, to carry quietly, to keep contained. What made the moment powerful wasn't what he explained, it was what he didn't elaborate on. He didn't talk about envy, or pressure, or fear of being left behind. But his voice softened, his language slowed. For a man known for control, that subtle shift was revealing. It was the closest Mick Jagger ever came to admitting that the Beatles weren't just competitors, they were a constant reference point. And once that door cracked open, it became impossible not to wonder what else had been left unsaid. Mick Jagger has never publicly said he was jealous of the Beatles. Not once. But jealousy isn't always about music. Sometimes it's about impact. The Beatles changed culture quickly and decisively. They arrived, conquered, and left. Their story is clean, finite, almost mythic. The Rolling Stones, by contrast, endured. They adapted. They survived decades longer than anyone expected. And survival comes with scars. Jagger has often praised the Beatles' songwriting while subtly reframing the conversation toward longevity. Influence fades, presence lasts. That distinction appears again and again in his interviews. What Mick seems reluctant to acknowledge is this: the Beatles set the terms of the conversation first. Every band that followed, including his own, reacted in some way. That doesn't mean defeat. It means pressure. And pressure shaped Mick's choices, the image, the attitude, the refusal to become sentimental. While the Beatles leaned inward artistically, Jagger leaned outward toward spectacle, provocation, and movement. Two different strategies, two different fears. Mick never says this outright, but his career reflects it. The Stones didn't need to be remembered as the best. They needed to remain unavoidable. And that may be the most honest response to Rivalry anyone could make. The strangest thing about the Beatles' Rivalry is that it still works. Decades later, a single comment can reignite debate. Rankings resurface. Interviews circulate. Fans argue as if time stopped in the 1960s. And Mick Jagger still navigates it with care. He doesn't escalate. He doesn't dismiss. He acknowledges just enough to keep control. That balance between respect and resistance has defined his entire relationship with the Beatles' legacy. The Rivalry didn't destroy him. It sharpened him. It forced him to evolve faster, perform harder, and think longer term than almost any of his peers. While others burned brightly and vanished, Mick stayed. And perhaps that's the final twist. The Rivalry was never about who won. It was about who adapted. The Beatles changed the rules. Mick Jagger learned how to live with them. And the fact that we're still talking about it proves something important. Some rivalries don't end because they were never meant to be resolved, only understood. If Mick Jagger learned anything from the Beatles' Rivalry, it was this: saying less can mean controlling more. Over the years, he perfected restraint. While others fired off quotes, Mick measured his words. While the media chased conflict, he redirected attention. And while fans demanded a winner, he refused to declare one. That wasn't indifference. It was discipline. Mick understood that rivalries age badly when they're fueled by emotion, so he let time do the work. He let career speak louder than comments, and he allowed the narrative to cool without ever fully closing it. Because closing it would mean letting go of something powerful. The Rivalry pushed him to sharpen his instincts, to build a persona that could withstand constant comparison, and to turn longevity into a statement of its own. The Stones didn't need a final chapter. They became the long story. When Mick finally acknowledged the Rivalry openly, it didn't sound bitter. It sounded reflective, almost relieved, as if admitting it no longer carried risk. That moment didn't rewrite history. It clarified it. The Rivalry wasn't about resentment. It was about pressure and how different artists survive it. And Mick Jagger survived by understanding something most never do. Sometimes, silence isn't avoidance. It's strategy. The Beatles' Rivalry didn't define Mick Jagger. It refined him. It forced choices. It exposed fears. It shaped an approach to fame that prioritized endurance over triumph. While others burned brightly and disappeared, Mick adapted again and again. That doesn't make one band better than the other. It makes them different. The Beatles changed music. Mick Jagger learned how to live inside the shadow of that change and still cast one of his own. And maybe that's why, decades later, the Rivalry still matters. Not because of who won, but because of what it reveals about ambition, pressure, and survival at the highest level. Some legends explode. Others endure. Mick chose endurance. So what do you think? Did Mick Jagger ever truly move past the Beatles' Rivalry? Or did it quietly shape everything he became? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy deep, cinematic stories about music, power, and the truths hidden between interviews, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because some rivalries never end, they just evolve.